Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special presentation from the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. I'm Dr. Jamie Marich, the founder and director of ICM. And this is a webinar that I hope we wouldn't have to do. I mean, I think it's always lovely to learn about working with people of cultures other than our own. So I welcome Nicole Allen today to talk to us about working with Ukrainians and Ukrainian-Americans and just aspects that clinicians need to be mindful of. Yet, obviously, the implications are even greater now because of what is happening in Ukraine. For all the information that Nikki is graciously willing to offer today. So this is, before I formally introduce Nikki or Nicole, this is a free webinar that ICM is offering. But if you do find the content helpful today, if you'd like to do some part to help in aid work, in relief effort, and what is going on in Ukraine right now, this is the organization that Nikki is recommending for us, Save the Children, specifically their Ukrainian Crisis Relief Fund. And I'm going ahead and doing a screen share on it now. We'll also put this link in both the Facebook video, the YouTube video, where this information will be shared. And I guess I'll say just give what you can based on what you're either able to do, or if you were to pay for a webinar like this, what would you feel good paying for it? And you can donate directly here to Save the Children and the Ukraine Relief Fund. So Nikki, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your Ukrainian heritage and connection?
Well, again, Jamie, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I do feel privileged in a lot of ways to be able to share my experience and this information, primarily because I'm not, directly impacted right now by the war in Ukraine because I'm in Texas in the United States. Um, so I'm privileged to be able to offer this perspective and experience, and I'm also very aware of the impact on myself and my community here. So my connection to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people started with my great-grandparents. They immigrated through Ellis Island in New York and came here, with the American dream, trying to find a better, safer home for them, considering the circumstances they had in Ukraine at the time. And since then, Ukrainian culture and heritage has been passed down in my family with a lot of pride, a lot of passion and self-expression. And I'm unique in that. I think me and the people in my generation and my family are unique that we experienced it with that kind of pride. Because originally my great-grandparents wanted to assimilate, to American culture. So they actually passed the language down to my grandparents, but it stopped there. It's very limited who can speak Ukrainian in my family right now. And they passed down stories, but there was always kind of that emphasis on this is where we came from and this is who we are now, right? So then there was sort of a cultural reawakening, I guess, in my family and in their community when my mom and her sisters were growing up, I would say in their adulthood, actually, and they passed that along to me and the people in my generation. So I grew up with Slavic folk dance, specifically Ukrainian folk dance, and I grew up in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. It was very much a part of my culture. The food, hearing the language, seeing the imagery. I have a traditional Ukrainian head dress behind me on the wall. It's called a vinok. That's something that I grew up wearing since I was 3 years old when I was performing cultural dance and at cultural events. And now I have formed or I'm part of a really beautiful community that is in Dallas, Texas, that's formed around Ukrainian immigrants and those of us that are second, third, fourth generation.
So speaking of the folklore connection, that is how Nikki and I really met. For those of you who follow my work, I'm of Croatian descent. It was also my great-grandparents who emigrated here. My grandparents, I like to say, were just barely born here. And there was a passing down of cultural traditions in our family, while also this kind of fierce desire to assimilate as well. So I think you and I just share a lot of connection to our ancestral homeland and people in Eastern Europe. And I clearly remember, Nikki, when you first came to take dancing mindfulness training, you reflected on the bit in the dancing mindfulness book that I wrote about being alive because of Croatian cultural dance, because that's how my parents met. And I think we've had a bond ever since then, understanding what it's like to be kids wearing traditional dresses and learning how to dance that way. But, I think as adults now, as clinical counselors who understand the impact of culture and just things being in your blood, in your DNA, how that's very much a part of us. And even when you are many generations removed from the homeland, when you care like that, what's happening in the homeland still affects you. Same thing happened with me during the Croatian War of Independence. So I, just want to express my kinship and solidarity and love and prayer with the Ukrainian people right now, and wanting to give you this platform to share with really clinicians, but anybody in human services, what you most want them to know right now. If they are working with a Ukrainian refugee, if they're working with somebody who's generations removed but still affected, that there's a lot of people who are feeling this right now. So I will turn it over to you. Apologies. And then you and I will have a bit of a talk back when we're done.
All right. And I think this is a great way to connect what you were just sharing about our connection with what I'm about to talk about for a long time. And that is that when I read the section in your book that mentioned your folk dance background, I immediately took a picture of it and sent it to my mom, because there was just this sense of excitement, a sense of trust even that I had in that moment, realizing this is someone who may understand why I'm wanting to integrate my experiences in dance and fine arts and creativity with mental health counseling. And it was something I wanted to share with my mom, because I wanted her to understand where I was headed in my clinical journey, because that's something that she's not as familiar with. So very grateful for our connection. And that leads me into what I'm going to share, and it is going to be mostly didactic. So I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to pull up.
And Nikki, just to mention, for participants watching this video, I will have a link in the notes on where you can access this PowerPoint. It can be downloaded on traumamadesimple.com/Ukraine. I will have that link in the presentation notes, whether you're seeing this on Facebook or YouTube.
Perfect. Yeah, hopefully I don't go through the slides too quickly. There is a lot of content, and I hate talking at people, especially people who aren't there live. So I'll try to be as concise as possible, which is not my strength, especially about when I'm passionate. So when I was approaching creating this presentation, I was trying to consider a lot of things that have happened over the last 2 weeks and what would be relevant for clinicians, helpers, and healers. I want to start off with really emphasizing that my approach to working with this population and what I think they need is very much a reflection of my position in the world. So my position in my Ukrainian-American community has a big role right now. But also, my training as a Western clinician. So I was trying, or am going to try to really focus on the cultural implications, and also honor that we have a framework that we use as clinicians as well. But hopefully we can maybe push on that framework a little bit and consider how might we need to approach some of this work uniquely with this population, just like we would with any cultural group that's experiencing targeted aggression and trauma. Right. So I did prepare for this by meeting with a few people and interviewing them, people who are at different places in their world and how they're impacted by the war. I got really valuable information, and it was also challenging because a lot of them are in crisis mode right now. And so I want to share some of what they shared with me, and also recommend that everyone watching this also is open to different or varying feedback from people who are Ukrainian nationals, who are Ukrainian immigrants, who have ties to the Ukrainian community, the Ukrainian-American community, the Ukrainian-European community, and everyone who's in Ukraine who is not Ukrainian. That's also a really big population that's targeted right now, non-citizens. So please be open to feedback and education from other people and other sources as well. I am not an expert in Ukrainian culture. I'm an expert in my awareness of it, right? All right, that's my big disclaimer. So I already mentioned Ukrainian folk dance is the biggest tie for me to the Ukrainian community. And this is relevant because it's for me and many people that I know that are Ukrainian or Slavic, culture is so important. So we really need to be thinking about how do we root our approach to working with these people within their cultural framework. So I put some photos here that I thought would help sort of illustrate that. So the one on the left-hand side of the screen is actually a photo after a cultural festival that me and my dance group, Zoria, Ukrainian Dancers of Dallas, performed at. The reason this photo is so powerful to me is that both my grandparents are there, and my brother was dancing in the group at the time. Both of my cousins were dancing in the group at the time, and the people framing the photo are my aunt and uncle, and they're extremely connected to Ukrainian culture. They're part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church up in Delaware. I guess he's like a second cousin or something. I don't know the way to phrase that, but he is a Ukrainian Orthodox priest. So these ties, cultural ties, are very strong in our family. And that's something that has brought us together, and it's something that binds us together during times of hardship. Even when we are disagreeing, it's something that we can connect over, and that's so common in Ukrainian culture. And then on the far right of this screen, I have my more present community that I think we've formed together, and that's of Ukrainian Americans and people who actually aren't Ukrainian, who just joined our group because we were friends and were welcomed and celebrated. And we formed a connection and a community that is kind of a subset of our Ukrainian American community, and we are family. We're, chosen family. And this is just my generation. These folks over here, that's my generation, but our parents and our grandparents are part of this community as well. And then we're connected with more recent immigrants and Ukrainian nationals. So there's just so many layers of how we experience our culture and how we celebrate it. So I do want to review some history, because if we are considering how to work with this population, history is important. And I can tell you, I grew up hearing Ukrainian history, and it wasn't at the top of my priority list. I'm still super ignorant about the history, which I'm ignorant about American history as well because of our education system. So that being said, there are key events that I think are important to understanding what led us to this conflict, to this war. Ukraine is no stranger to suffering. Ukraine is no stranger to invasion and occupation and colonization. This is a repeated generational systemic trauma that has happened through so many generations. And understanding that is really going to help us to understand the current impact and why, out of all the war-torn countries in the world, why is this one, or how is it unique? Well, in a lot of ways, it's similar to African countries. not comparing the gravity of the colonization and impact, but there's similar history in that there was repeated assaults on nationality, on identity, on culture, on language, on livelihood, economics. So that leads us into the history. And this is up here for anybody who wants to like hit pause, you know, or look at the PowerPoint if you have access to it, please do. I don't want to bore you with a history lesson, right? But all the way back from the 9th century, we have the beginning of what it would become Ukraine. And that's why if you're hearing some of the disinformation now that Ukraine was part of Russia and that Ukraine broke from Russia and that that's unjust, that is disinformation. There's lots of Russian occupation and colonization, however, was never just Russian. Russia didn't become what it is today until, you know, the past few centuries either. So looking at this history, we've got a lot of violence and occupation, again, mixed in with a lot of efforts to form some sort of a Ukrainian or a national identity. And that's the big takeaway that I take from this far back, you know, past history. When you hear people talk about the religions in Ukraine, Orthodox Christianity was the original really organized religion, which is why attacks on that faith base are so devastating and have been so devastating. And let me see what other things from this page of history stand out to me. We have the Cossacks rising up, and these are the people that are actually pictured in that picture at the top. That's actually the male dancers from my folk dance group. So they are acting out how the Cossack warriors would defend and become a very big source of defense against occupation, against invasion. And so this, again, this pride in being able to protect your homeland is already being developed and passed down through generations. And we do have here at the end of this timeline, we do have where Russian control is sort of solidified in a big part of what is now modern day Ukraine. So I do want to acknowledge that Russia, from the early stages of Ukrainian formation, if you will, Russia was already trying to gain control. And then we have this Treaty of Eternal Peace. It's something that I grew up hearing about that was supposed to end the Ottoman Empire War. And so, of course, you may be thinking, okay, then there was peace. We are going to continue with the history. All right. So we're into the early 1900s. It's probably going to feel a little bit more relevant to folks. 1918 is the first year that Ukrainian independence was really declared, resulting in a civil war. So again, lots of conflict, even just within the population. And then we shift into Soviet rule. And this is where a lot of disinformation starts to emerge about the state of Ukraine and just the history in general. So we have about a split majority of Ukraine controlled by Russia, and then Poland is controlling the western third. We have the Holodomor, which was a man-made famine that wiped out an estimated 3.9 million Ukrainians, created by Stalin in order to have more control. Moving into World War II, imagine beginning World War II after that much of your population has just been wiped out. We've got the Soviet Union literally stealing Western Ukraine, and then Nazi occupation. And I know for me, as I'm going through this, I'm already getting like overwhelmed at all of this oppression. So we've got Nazi occupation. That's something that I don't think gets enough attention. The majority of the Jewish population in Ukraine at the time was exterminated, for lack of a better term. The Jewish population, last statistic I looked up, was 1% in Ukraine of people who identify with the Jewish faith. I mean, this was a targeted attack and, ethnic cleansing from the Nazis. Moving into the 1960s and 70s, we have resistance to Soviet rule, and there is infighting, between Soviets and Nazis. And there's something that I think is a very charged topic right now that's coming up a lot, and that is Ukrainian nationalism really started to form, from my perspective of reading the history and hearing about it, really started to form around this time as a more modern concept of what nationalism looks like, because there was such a rising up against oppression, but it couldn't be done as overtly as we can do it here in the States or in other Western countries, right, that have more of a free media. And within that resistance comes this fierce national pride. I am Ukrainian, and my family, my community has been so oppressed, and so my pride and my nationality becomes very, very fierce. I'm literally fighting for our right to exist. There were some folks who were so passionate about their nationalism, they ended up sympathizing with, and some of them fighting on behalf of the Nazis against Soviet rule. And that is not to give them a free pass. However, when we look back on history, I think it is important to understand Putin today, modern day Putin, is not just throwing out the term Nazi sympathizers or Nazis when he is trying to justify his invasion of Ukraine. He knows that there is a part of Ukrainian history that a lot of folks aren't proud of. That's a part of history that in places like Germany, they teach in their education system. They educate their young people to say, we are not giving them a pass. I can't think of another word. We're not condoning what they did, and we are holding them accountable. We also want to look at the reason that so many people were Nazi sympathizers at the time, right? But we're going to emphasize the accountability. So in Ukraine, from what I understand, there's growing emphasis on that accountability of the people at that time. However, Putin knows that he can use that to say, there were once some Nazi sympathizers in Ukraine. I can spin this to say that there are Nazi sympathizers now. In fact, there's Nazis in the government, right? And we've had a resurgence of white supremacy. And I shouldn't say that. There's always been white supremacy since the creation of the concept of race. However, there's been growing attention to white supremacy in our media, right? Especially in the West. And so it makes sense when we hear that. It makes sense to the modern day Russian people in Russia who are only exposed often to the propaganda in their media because it is Russian controlled. And so they hear that and they're often not really sure. That's what I'm hearing. A lot of people are like, oh, Nazis, and I'm not expecting that, but I do remember it from way back when. I remember hearing that, right? So you can kind of see how some of this really brainwashing and gaslighting is happening. They're using the history against these people. So 1986, we have what has become a pretty infamous event in Chernobyl. The reason I include it here is because it brings another spotlight to Ukraine, and the explosion, infects Europe in general. And I know folks who grew up around Chernobyl who were impacted by it. They're still feeling the health effects of it. All right. So this is some imagery from Ukrainian independence in the 90s. And I just was struck by a lot of these photos. It's something that I've heard a lot about and is celebrated in my community every year. And it's very important to folks. So if you can imagine being someone of these generations that are alive now, if this is most of your imagery of what independence means and what nationality for you means, what culture means, imagine overnight someone coming in and trying to erase that. So, continuing with Ukrainian independence, and this, really is important, but I'm not going to go through all of this. We have the collapse of the Soviet Union lining up with Ukrainian independence. And we have the emergence of a new democratic government in Ukraine. And honestly, it's rife with corruption at the same time, just like any government that is, young can be. But also we have just direct influence and infiltration from the Russian government. And that is something that the Ukrainian people overall have been resisting since the 1991 independence. So we have the events that, really directly lead up to why is Putin angry right now, right? Not sure any of us, even therapists, can answer all of that. But why politically and geopolitically is he doing this? There was a lot of growth in the past 30 years for Ukraine. A lot of emergence of leaders who were better equipped to represent the people. And that is not something that a dictator wants, an occupier wants. So there's actually a lot of good media out there right now that are breaking down this more modern history. And so I really hope that people, when they have the bandwidth, are able to absorb a lot of that, because you can see how desperately the general population of Ukraine wanted their independence and wanted their voice to be represented in their government, and still do. So we have some rigged elections, and eventually we get to the Maidan Revolution. There is a wonderful documentary on Netflix that you can watch about this. It is very graphic. It is very intense, but it is something that I think, again, will help people understand Ukrainians are not, I can't think of what I'm saying. They are no stranger to this type of violence and this type of oppression, even just as recently as 2013 to 2014. So the Maidan Revolution was when students, college students, started with them, came to Kyiv, the capital, and started protesting because of a corrupt election, which had been overturned, and then the president that was a Putin sympathizer, Yushchenko, was elected, and Parliament withdrew their NATO membership bid. This was huge to Ukraine, and we can certainly see why now. I remember hearing about this, and I was like, I don't really get why being part of NATO is that big of a deal. Yeah, we can see it now, even if we're ignorant to, how war works in our world. So NATO provides a safety net for Ukraine. Ukrainian politicians and Ukrainian people know that Russia is always there as a shadow, wanting their land, wanting their resources, wanting their trade routes, wanting to shift the culture or occupy the culture as they did in the past, making the Ukrainian language illegal, making different the Eastern Orthodox religion illegal. So NATO is a big deal. And the fact that Parliament withdrew that bid really pissed people off. So they came for peaceful protests, and they remained doing peaceful resistance when their own government attacked them for most of this what's now called a revolution. They resisted fierce violence. These security forces, who are considered like a elite form of police, were sent by the Ukrainian government, which at the time was really influenced by Russia, and attacked their own civilians. So we can start to hear echoes of this in peaceful protests that we have now in the U.S. We can hear, okay, so police violence and brutality, that sounds familiar. But I got to tell you, I did not understand the impact of this violence against these protesters until I watched that documentary and was doing more research for this presentation. it was horrific. It was a war zone. So you have 103 protesters eventually confirmed killed, as well as 13 of these, police forces, and just a ton of injuries and gunshot wounds. There should not have been live rounds and ammunition used against civilians, not for peaceful protests. So these are some images from that revolution, that conflict. And people came from around Ukraine. People came from outside Ukraine to be part of this movement. So ultimately, the movement was successful in so that the current president fled Ukraine at the time, and a more democratic, I would say, government came into effect. If you talk to a lot of Ukrainians right now, they're going to say, "Well, there's still corruption there, right?" But overall, the movement was successful in a lot that it had set out to do. And yet, we then have continued resistance and occupation from Russia. And the way I conceptualize this is that Putin's Russia is a abusive partner, and they do not like that their victim is taking back more power and control. They are becoming more independent. They can see the cycle of abuse and violence, and abuser doesn't like that. So what does abuser do? They act out and they try to solidify more power and control. They gaslight, they manipulate. And they try to isolate the victim as well. Trying to isolate Ukraine from allies is a huge power play from Putin. So we have what I think is pretty well known right now about the annexation of Crimea by Russia, which is completely illegal. And Putin starts to send troops into like the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which are on that Russian border, and basically steals them. And this sounds really familiar from other things in the history. And we have this conflict zone that emerges. People are super aware that there's war happening in their country, and yet it's not declared war, and it's very uncertain. Where is this going to go? So leading into 2018, with the EU agreement, formalized connection and support from the rest of Europe. Again, we have Ukraine as a kind of identity. I conceptualize that as sort of breathing a sigh of relief. Okay, we've got some more support. Again, abuser doesn't like that. So abuser comes in and continues with this occupation of Crimea. And fast forwarding into this past year, the past few weeks and months, really, we see continued steps to take more control of Ukraine. And so imagine what Ukrainian nationals are experiencing at that time. Imagine what their family and friends are experiencing around the world, and people who are part of that cultural community wondering, is my homeland going to be invaded, or is this just another scare tactic? 2 weeks ago, people were still joking about World War III as if it would never happen. Today, we're talking about it as if it is a very real possibility, right? So think of just the emotional, mental health implications of this tension building up to today, really. So Putin moves around 100,000 troops to the Ukrainian border and makes demands that NATO and allies withdraw any support of Ukraine, trying to isolate the victim as much as possible. And now we have the events of the past 2 weeks. And you've probably been seeing these all over the news, so I'm not going to go into them in depth. It's honestly very fresh and triggering for a lot of folks too, because it's so recent. So on this last kind of part of this timeline, we've got from February 24th up to today. And the confirmed deaths in Ukraine of 474, that was as of this morning, the most updated number I could find. That's surely not everything, all the deaths, and unknown injuries. How do you count at this point when it's an active war zone? We've got reports of assault and rape. We've got reports of civilians being attacked, documented war crimes. And you've got all of this wondering what if related to international support. So imagine being someone who is impacted directly or indirectly by this war and wondering, are our allies going to step in some way more than they have, more than sanctions? What if they do? What if that triggers a World War III? There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of hypervigilance. So before I move on, Dr. Marich, do you have anything that you want to add as you've been listening? So we're going to shift a little.
Yeah, Nikki, I wanted to, express your appreciation for giving us some context around, the Nazism slur being thrown around. This is something as a Croat I relate to intimately, because if you know Croatian history, well, yes, we sided with the Nazis during the Second World War. There was a reason for that. And again, it's not to give that free pass. And I do hope, and this is something I call out Croatians for a lot, that there is a lot of rise in the accountability. And yes, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it for sure. Yet it's also very interesting and very telling how the disinformation gets put out there and how people's perspectives on history can be drastically different based on who's telling the history. We know that all too well here in the US, right? So I think for me, what resonated the most so far in what you presented is having a knowledge of that context, because it is something that I think is a lot of non-Ukrainians without the context are wondering, well, where's this coming from? So, yeah. And there's so much I could say from a trauma perspective. And I'm also glad to hear how you tied in that language of the abuser. And, isn't so much of global conflict about the hunger, the thirst for power? And what is abuse but when there's a power differential? Doing whatever you have to do and that power slipping away. So that's all I got right now.
Thank you for also touching on the fact that these are not completely isolated or unique experiences from Ukrainian history. There's a lot of messiness in the history of Europe in general. There's messiness in our history all over the world. But especially when a community, a culture is attacked and their history is used against them, I think it's super important to understand at least a bare understanding of their history because of that. And I also am super aware that I didn't get educated in Ukraine. So I don't know fully how much the accountability culture is there. That's something that I think right now shouldn't be our focus. It should also be on the victims of this war. And I'm going to try to continue to call them victims as we go through, because that is really, I think, the best fitting term right now. So the next slide is going to show some more politicized images, and I'm going to touch on it briefly. I have a rationale for it, but I want to put that out there. I'm aware that not everyone viewing this presentation has political beliefs that align with mine, but this is also not a reflection of mine necessarily. So the reason I included this slide is because a lot of the people viewing this presentation, I believe, are going to be in Western countries, right, where there's more accessibility to mental health resources and services. Right now, the people providing relief in Ukraine are not going to sit down and watch a presentation, and they don't need to know their history from me or the cultural considerations, right? So I'm talking to people who may be struggling to understand, how can this level of disinformation infect a country with so many people and serve to justify an invasion, an illegal war? Well, first of all, Putin's actions do not reflect the overall Russian population. A lot of the Russian population, though, it's being reported, is confused, is bewildered, and also looking for answers. Why would we be doing this? Why are our brothers and sisters in Ukraine being attacked? Because there's such a connection between Ukraine and Russia. They're in so many ways coming from the same ancestors. We saw that in the history. So the idea of killing and assaulting their people who they often consider to be brothers and sisters doesn't make sense. So people in power understand this, and if you're trying to control the minds of the general population, you do that through political corruption, spreading of disinformation, propaganda, in order to isolate your victim, to turn people against them. And if we are looking for how to relate to them, if I'm in the counselor chair as an American, and I'm looking for ways to identify with the confusion from maybe a client who is Russian or people in my community who are Russian who are receiving this disinformation, I have no farther to look than my own government and the ways that disinformation is spread and the ways that that impacts whole groups of people in American culture. So something I think to consider, a way to access some empathy, because as we go through the rest of this presentation, I do want to emphasize that there is going to be continued division between communities around the world, not just in Ukraine and Russia, but in Ukrainian communities, in Russian communities, in other Slavic communities, other European communities. There's going to be bullying, there's going to be division, because that's often what we do when we are targeted, when we are stressed, and when there's disinformation. So we're going to shift into some cultural considerations. And again, you could spend years learning about Ukrainian culture. So this is just like bare bones. So on the left here, talking about what I consider to be very much appropriate when you think of the lens of intersectionality theory. We've got intersecting influences of Western culture and Slavic culture. You saw that in the history. So it makes sense that it's a bit of a eclectic bunch, right? And Ukraine has a rich history of things like cultural arts, literature, theater, performance art, sporting events, architecture, more recently free media, TV shows, performance artists that are then televised, movies. That's not, that is something that is at danger of being not erased, because the people will continue to pass it on, but it is at threat here. It's the people that are being threatened, it's their homes, and it is their culture. In Ukraine, there are a variety of foods, but traditional foods and traditional customs are emphasized and valued. So a lot of the things that I grew up with that actually weren't emphasized in my grandparents' home as much actually had a resurgence, right? And in Ukraine, it's very, very much emphasized. So if you're working with someone who is Ukrainian or part of this community, they may really be finding a lot of comfort in cultural media, in cultural art, in cultural customs and food. And this is something I wanted to add to the slide so I didn't forget it, but it is an opinion. So I preface by saying that Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans in general tend to have a very passionate and often intense demeanor, and their nonverbals can be a little off-putting to people who maybe grew up in, like, I don't know, parts of white America, where we're pretty pleasing and we're pretty polite and we're pretty nice and we always smile at strangers, because heaven forbid we don't have a smile on our face, right? I was talking with a Ukrainian immigrant recently, and they were like, people need to understand we have resting BITCH face. And I was like, oh yeah, I know that. That's, yeah, that's a lot of the women in my family, yep. And you know what? They are equal parts lovely, nurturing, and compassionate. and equal parts intense and sometimes critical and firm, right? And I find those qualities emerge in myself, in my journey through the world and in my relationships. So if you are working with someone who's impacted by this right now, first of all, they're in crisis. So they are not potentially going to be in a very ventral vagal connecting type state. But also just understand if they don't smile at you and ask you how you're doing, that's also sometimes cultural. So it's not about you. Please just consider that and maybe set that aside. And then there was a tweet that I put up here on the right-hand side that I just found very funny as things can be right now during this time. And I sent it to a mass text to my family because it definitely applies to at least the Ukrainian-American culture. And the tweet is talking about if you put two Ukrainians in a room, they'll form three political parties. But if you threaten them, they become one family. The amount of conflict and oftentimes division, even in basic values within my family and within my community here, there's an I don't know, I can't count them. However, if you threaten us, if you target us, if you insult someone we care about, we are one family. And that's a lot of what you're seeing right now. The world is seeing that Ukraine has developed this resilience and these strategies for survival because of the oppression of the past, and also because of the strong values within cultural connection and family connection. All right, this was a tweet straight from the official Ukrainian Twitter account that I saw the other day that I thought was very on point. They're trying to emphasize what Ukraine stands for because obviously they are desperate for support from the global community and understanding. These are people. This is not just borders and trade routes and resources and oil. This is about people who have values and legacies that are being attacked. And that's happening to a lot of people around the world. So emphasizing and honoring these values and the value of the freedom and safety of Ukrainians does not devalue the oppression in the rest of the world. I do want to be clear to emphasize that. So if you are someone working with this population, you also just may want to be aware of a few of these things. Religion is often a big part of maybe what someone might want to bring to a clinical setting. So you may want to do a little bit more research on what faith base your client has. A lot of it's going to probably be Eastern Orthodox, or you might hear, Greek Catholic, some Roman Catholic representation here. Those are the big ones. And then language-wise, lots of history with the language. It's funny, I can tell you when I hear a Russian speaker and a Ukrainian speaker, I can tell who's speaking which language. Can't understand 99% of it, but I can tell because it's slightly different, right? So a lot of folks that you're working with who are probably from the western part of Ukraine, or that's their ancestry, probably are going to speak Ukrainian and the alphabet is Cyrillic. And then more from the eastern part of Ukraine might say they speak Russian. Doesn't mean they identify as Russian, but that's because of all these different movements of occupation. And then we have all of these other languages, right? And English is something that especially a lot of folks in Western countries speak as well. Mental health care, overall culturally, not something that is prioritized. Even I've heard Ukrainians say, we don't talk about our feelings, at the same time that they're expressing intense anger or intense sorrow or intense joy. So Ukrainians and Slavic people have feelings, they just express them differently. Dr. Marich, I could see your reaction to that.
Oh, I relate to that, Nikki. Very well expressed.
It's in my family, the emphasis is on the emotions of females. And also, I've been talking in pretty gender binary terms because that's a lot of what you see represented in Eastern Europe is more binary identities. Doesn't mean there aren't people there who identify in different places on the gender spectrum. But there's lots of jokes in our community here about, you know, the strength and stubbornness of Ukrainian women and Ukrainian-American women. And I always saw that played out in my family. And then as I became a mental health counselor, I saw it play out as even resistance to deep emotional expression, expression of a variety of emotions and not just the big intense ones, you know, like anger and joy and pride. Um, Everyone feels all of these emotions in different ways. It just might be how they express them, right? So consider that as you're going to work with this population, you know, maybe 6 months from now when things have calmed more and you're able to give them that invitation to dive into and sit with these emotions, it may be that the resistance you're getting from them is not just resistance to, you know, trusting you, or it may not even be that they're not ready to go there. It just may be that culturally they don't talk about that stuff and they don't sit with those emotions. So working with them to identify ways that they can express the range of emotions that they're comfortable expressing, right? And in our work, we're always challenging people. We need to challenge ourselves too to consider that vulnerability may not be something that they want to share with me. I will say though, the past 2 weeks, I've seen more vulnerability from my Ukrainian Dallas community than I've seen the entire time I've known them. So there's something that has shifted. There's something about the crisis impact of this. There's something about the fear that is showing or giving them a lot of opportunity to just be vulnerable and ask for help and express sorrow. And I hate that this is something that needed to be a catalyst for that. But it has been pretty humbling for me. I've connected with some folks in deeper ways than I have in 20 years. So this is a slide that I put together, and I look forward to when there's some actual research on this in the years to come. I wish we didn't have to have the research, but I hope that we get to hear more stories. I hope that there's some really solid narratives that we get from folks who've been impacted by this. Their stories right now are being silenced. That's a part of the act of war. And so this is what I've gathered from my experience so far in my community, watching the news and the impact on Ukrainian nationals, and then these interviews that I did with folks here who have family, you know, in Ukraine. So just some impacts on Ukrainian nationals. Obviously, this is an invasion of their home. This is an attack on their national identity, which for them often feels personal. So if you're considering working with refugees from Ukraine, consider that impact. Consider that, yeah, they might be physically safe in the near future even, but they're feeling this in so many ways on a personal level, not just because they had to flee their home, but because of their national shared identity. Obviously, we have all of the traumatic impacts that I hope people are already educated in. And if you're not familiar, the theories behind and neuroscience behind trauma is quickly evolving. Please, please, please take a CE course, do some reading, pull out your dusty copy of, you know, Body Keeps the Score or Trauma Made Simple by Dr. Marich. Refresh yourself, because these people, I'm not going to say they're going to emerge from this traumatized, but the likelihood's very high. And trauma is all about that experience that people have when their ability to cope is overwhelmed. Think about being in a war zone. Think of the impact of that and how much that's likely to overwhelm their ability to cope. Even though we see them super focused, right now in my community, there's a group of folks at a place called Yuki Style in Dallas that is just working round the clock truly to send aid, and thousands of dollars of relief funding to their families and friends in Ukraine. And I'm witnessing them jump right into action mode. And yet they are being potentially traumatized, right? So you may see them being very active, you may see them going to work, and yet the trauma is probably underneath the surface. But we also may not be able to do the trauma work yet, right? Which I'll talk about in a minute. So still towards the top of this slide, we've got hypervigilance, obviously. Central nervous system dysregulation, I can't imagine right now. I cannot imagine what people's nervous systems are experiencing, especially the people in Ukraine. When they're not cut off from the news, they are glued to the news. So they're on overload. You know, what a privilege that a lot of us have, that right now we're balancing how much news we intake with self-care and with family and friend time, with spiritual and healing practices. We're privileged to do that, find that balance in order to then help and support these people who are not privileged to do that. They cannot turn off the news when they can at least access it, right? Because that could mean life or death for them, these updates that they're getting. There's also an interdependence within families and community, which I find to be a beautiful thing that's coming from this already, is that, you know, you see people on your news station probably already relying on their neighbors, relying on the Ukrainian military and these relief aid organizations that are coming in to try to help refugees at the border. So that interdependence is super, super important, and I believe is going to form a very strong bond for future days, I guess. And then there is, of course, this experience of being cut off from loved ones. You know, my uncle is communicating with, or second cousin is communicating with our family in Ternopil, Ukraine. I know a lot of folks here that I've been talking to who are checking in with their family once a day, but they can't check in constantly because there's not cell phone service, because the internet is out over there, because their phones aren't charged, right? Because they're on the move to find safety at a border. So this experience of being in a war zone and being cut off from your support systems, I mean, just how traumatizing. And then this second chunk of information here, I wanted to speak to secondary victims, or the people that I'm referring to as those outside of Ukraine right now who are being impacted. So a lot of what I'm hearing, and my personal experience too, just not as intensely as a lot of these folks, is guilt and shame because they are not there. They are not the ones being targeted. They are in many ways helpless to bring relief to their families, or to just people of their nation, right? And then we have this duality of roles. So for example, a lot of folks right now in the US and in other places across the world, they are torn between their Ukrainian loyalty and wanting to just be glued to the news 24/7, wanting to be calling their family and friends 24/7, and they also have to go to work. They have to make a living. They have to support their children. I heard people talking about, you know, grief that their children are having birthdays, and someone graduated from college, and they're like, oh my God, we're in crisis mode, but I also need to support my family and celebrate these huge milestones, right? People are trying to buy homes. People are trying to make moves in their career. People are trying to build relationships. And they're trying to take care of themselves so that they don't completely burn out. I mean, the duality here is huge. And then there's an additional role, an element of duality when it comes to secondary victims who are also mental health professionals, or who are also healthcare professionals, who are also in the teaching profession, leaving a bunch out. But anybody that's considered a helper healer, they're still being required to support their population in their community. And they're hearing about all of this impacting their community in Ukraine, their family. How the heck do you separate that? I'm having a hard time in my sessions separating it when my clients who have no connection to Ukraine bring it up and want to talk about it. Every day I'm wrestling with, today am I in a place that I can share with them that I have ties to this community and that I am being impacted. I'm not my best self right now. Some days I feel like I can share part of that with them, other days I cannot. And that's evolving. has been over the last few weeks. So I only imagine what it is like for people who have immediate family over there that they're very close to, or who immigrated here, came here themselves as a refugee. And isolation, even within present communities, so like someone who maybe immigrated from Ukraine has a present community and identity, there's this question people are asking, does anyone else care? You know, the news media cares, but they also sensationalize things. There's ratings to consider. The government says they care, and yet these people are hearing that there's not as much the government can do, you know, concerning things like a no-fly zone or direct military action against Russia. So a lot of people are experiencing that as my government doesn't care, my community doesn't care. I heard it described by someone as, you know, it's like grief. Everybody shows up the first day after you lose someone with a casserole, with thoughts and prayers. They show up and they let you lean on their shoulder, they give you a hug, and they always tell you, I'm here for you, let me know what you need. Where are they in 6 months? Where are they in 2 years? The reality is that we are all experiencing hardship and sometimes suffering throughout our lives. We can't be there for everyone all the time. And yet that often means that people experiencing something like this, just like grief and loss, feel super abandoned. They feel uncared for. And that's something we're already hearing, and this hasn't even been going on for 2 whole weeks. And finally, we've got emerging unrest and division in what should be beautifully diverse Slavic communities. There are huge communities of Ukrainians and Ukrainian speakers around the world, especially in the US. There's big hubs. Mine in Dallas is actually not as big as a lot of the hubs. And there's already division. For example, there's already bullying of Russian children. There's already people who have family in Russia who are saying, you know, I feel like Ukraine should just stop agitating the aggressor. Wow, that sounds familiar. Sounds just like someone telling a victim, why don't you just change? Why are you agitating him? That's already happening. There's mistrust from Ukrainians of some Russian folks. It makes sense. They're in crisis mode. They are trying to assess who is the enemy, who is safe. And yet I also hear a lot of empathy for Russian speakers who are not at all tied and do not endorse Russian aggression. So there's already a lot happening in our communities here outside of Ukraine. And I think that that's going to evolve. I don't know what that's going to look like long term. I grew up hearing, for lack of a better word, gossip about Russian nationalists. It was something that as I became an adult, I didn't really care for because I knew Russian people and I thought that they were wonderful people. And yet I also knew that there's wonderful people and then there's traumatized people who traumatize other people in every culture and community, right? But it's going to be hard for us, I think, in the immediate aftermath of this or as it's going on to differentiate between that. What is the nuance of it? So you're probably going to hear that with your clients, unfortunately. So we are hearing more and more reports of what I believe should be a obviously sort of phenomenon, right? Anytime you have conflict, there's going to be a more disproportioned impact on marginalized or targeted or underrepresented communities. And I'm sure that we're not getting the full picture of this yet. We're only getting some brief reports so far, right? But there's more growing awareness of how these underrepresented populations in Ukraine are being impacted. Children and youth, although they are being prioritized as people who should be able to evacuate as refugees, these kids, some of them are at their critical periods of development and they're experiencing war. This is something that we see the impact of in other war-torn countries all the time. So that's one of the reasons that I actually asked for this presentation, for the donations for it to go to the Save the Children organization, because I'm a play therapist. I work with children. I work with marginalized teenagers. I'm terrified for these kids. My first experience is growing up in the Ukrainian folk dance group. when I took on leadership positions, I taught the children's section of our group. And I'm thinking of those kids and how they're impacted. Um, Women and gender non-binary folks, even if they're not identifying that way, they are at risk. I heard the first reports yesterday of assault against women. I can guarantee you, knowing statistics about rape across the world, they will not be the last, and they're certainly not the only instances, whether it's from Russian soldiers against women and gender non-binary folks, or from other people who are not their best selves and already have abusive intention. They're going to take advantage of vulnerable populations. And also, when you consider that it's a lot of the women and children who are being allowed to evacuate or encouraged to evacuate, they are then separated from, often if they have a male partner, or in case of children, a male caregiver, they're being told to stay behind. They're not allowed to leave. They have to fight if it comes to that. So they've just potentially lost their patron of their home. It's a pretty patriarchal system still, and that's not just devastating to lose someone in that way that you care for and love, but someone that is considered to you a provider. And we're getting more and more reports of and concern for the disabled community in Ukraine. There are millions of people who identify as part of this community. They can't evacuate with the same access. There are organizations that have the resources to help them evacuate, can't get in. They can't get vans that are wheelchair accessible into an active war zone. There's people being left behind because someone perceives that they're not physically or mentally able to keep up, right? I do think this is where the community interdependence is going to play a part. I think that hopefully there will be some protectiveness over people in this population who are suddenly faced with a lot more limitations than they were 2 weeks ago, right? And there's a lot of people of color, Africans, particularly African students. We're getting more and more footage and reports that they are being discriminated against. Again, unfortunately, not surprising what often happens to people of color during a crisis like this. They are the ones who feel the impact of it the most, that disproportionate impact. And there is systems of systemic racism in Eastern Europe, just like there are in the US. So there was already discrimination against these people. It's just not televised. It's not discussed as much. Being turned away at the border because you don't have a Ukrainian passport is a problem. That's something that allegedly is being addressed now, but just because the people who are regulating the borders and who are filtering the refugees, just because they're overwhelmed and just because we understand they may have been given an order to prioritize Ukrainian nationals, completely unacceptable that there is this obvious discrimination and racism going on, because those African people, those people from other countries outside of Ukraine are people too. They were in Ukraine, part of the community. And then, it's interesting, I haven't heard anything about the queer community. I looked for it. Maybe there's some reporting out there, but I wonder if that's because queer identities are not as represented, at least covertly, in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. But I gotta tell you, there's definitely queer people over there. There's queer people everywhere. And they are most certainly feeling the impact of this. If they were oppressed before, it's just going to be exacerbated now. And I'm also very aware that this is not an all-inclusive list, and I really don't mean to leave anyone off. I wanted to highlight the identities and populations that I've either heard of being most impacted or I expect are being most impacted. And this is also why we need really sound qualitative narratives to come out of this, not necessarily in a research standpoint, but like we need to be hearing from the people not just looking at statistics when we look at the impact of this. And that is a privilege we have as clinicians or helpers, is that we do get to hear the stories and then hopefully get to amplify them in some way. Dr. Marich, did you want to come on the mic?
Yeah, just a thought as you were talking about queer folks, LGBTQI, and again, my perspective is from another Eastern European country, but I will just say, although there are organizations promoting pride throughout Eastern Europe, it's still largely an unsafe place to be queer or trans or non-binary. So I echo fully what you're saying, that during times of crisis, people who are ordinarily hidden in certain cultures are likely going to be feeling it worse. I know firsthand as well from the disabled community in Croatia and Ukraine as well, that this happens. Like even in good times, there's a need to hide. And I mean, I'm sure you and I could go into scores of commentary here about what culture means, and can you still have pride in your culture while also critique your culture. I think that's a topic for another webinar. Yet with the issue at hand today, I'm glad you have highlighted the existence of, I guess, I don't know, I don't think it's an overstep to call it an intersectionality of the suffering, because you have a suffering population anyway in a group of people who have been traditionally oppressed. And then there's substrata of oppression within that oppressed group. And I don't have answers other than I'm glad you pointed it out. I'm glad that a lot of people listening to this will have a trauma-informed framework for dealing with it. And we can talk more about this at the end of your presentation. You know, how do you work in a trauma-informed framework when you are working with people from cultures that may feel even less trauma-informed than what we deal with here? And again, I don't have answers. It's just a lot of questions, and let's have you continue, and then hopefully we can wrap this up with some kind of cogent discussion, which can feel hard when the world seems like it's falling apart.
Oh yes, it's definitely challenging right now. I even think about people who are intaking this information right now. It's probably really challenging to do. So I'm going to go back because I do want to touch on something you just mentioned, Dr. Marich. These identities on the left and all the other different or salient or not salient identities, they're not just isolated. So the way that someone experiences this crisis between these communities and within these communities will be potentially unique for them, but also it'll be unique based on how their intersecting identities coexist. So if I am working with someone who is Ukrainian, maybe like first generation Ukrainian immigrant, or I'm sorry, first generation Ukrainian, and is a person of color and is LGBT. Someone who is non-binary and identifies as someone in a community of folks with disabilities. They're going to have unique experiences of this, ones that we should not assume, ones that we can become educated about. Like, I need to know enough about their community and hopefully have worked with this community before and be up on the latest research and understanding of it. But I'm not going to assume how they're being impacted. And I think it's important to acknowledge there may be folks with these identities who aren't comfortable sharing because of the cultural emphasis on, gayness is not something that is celebrated. Maybe it's tolerated, but not celebrated in my community. And that may be different in parts of Ukraine, and it may be different for folks who have ancestral heritage in Ukraine, but are living in another part of the world. So specifically, if I'm speaking here to clinicians or people who are working from a more clinical or mental health focus, there are some considerations that I think that we should have at the forefront of our work right now, or just our interaction with these folks in our communities. So we need to brush up on those trauma-informed care considerations from SAMHSA. They're not just something you looked at during a continuing education presentation. They're super important right now. If you don't work with a high crisis population, you probably need to be reminded what some crisis intervention looks like, because you may be doing that. You may not be doing as much deep processing. And that could look different with a client that you've worked with for 2 years already, and now they're in crisis mode, versus someone who's coming into your office for the first time. And we can't predict what that's going to look like from folks. I'm experiencing high hypervigilance or intense shutdown, but mostly high hypervigilance and action. They want action. They want to know what they can do. They want to know what will help their loved ones and people in their home country to survive. What can I do? What helps me to feel like I'm not just sitting over here waiting to hear news of tragedy, right? So a lot of that is going to mean resourcing and stabilization work. And I think we need to balance not being condescending with this, and also, firmly emphasizing that we want to offer people opportunities to ground, opportunities to connect with the present, connect with what they have control over. And again, if they're like, screw you, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about in this session. I'm not going to do any kind of meditation or grounding. Then I say, all right, that's where you're at right now. But I am going to offer it as an opportunity. I don't find visual or guided imageries right now to be helpful with folks that are in any type of crisis mode personally, because their minds just don't shut off as easily. But physical grounding, grounding through art, even maybe more like controlled art, grounding through journaling, grounding through just the 5 senses, a lot of the basic grounding that we should have in our toolkit. But guess what? When we're in crisis mode, when we are being actively traumatized, we forget we have a toolkit. And we need someone to just remind us, hey, you either have a lot of these skills and I'm willing to do them with you, or you've never developed these skills. And so I have a lot of them. I have knowledge of them. Are you open to engaging with them? And then I really think we need to remain grounded in those core conditions. We really need to remember to be congruent. We need to remember to have unconditional positive regard for folks coming to us, even if they are really not in a connecting place. I don't want to say they're not fun to be with right now, because no client needs to be fun, right? But these are going to be hard sessions, y'all. Even if it's just that someone's so shut down because this is the first hour they have of their day where they can just breathe. That's a hard session to sit through. So dig deep for that unconditional positive regard. And I know that a lot of us are traumatized right now, whether it's from a global pandemic or racial injustice and systemic oppression in our communities. Loss, like, we're feeling it all, and we've been helpers and healers through most of this, but they deserve some unconditional acceptance from us. And empathy, active listening skills. They may just need to talk at you the whole session. You may not get in a word edgewise. You also may not have a full session. They might be like, yep, I'm here. And after 10 minutes, that window of tolerance closes. And so maybe that's when you recommend a grounding exercise. Maybe that's when you recommend that the rest of their session time, they could consider just taking a walk around your building before they get in the car. Consider, listening to a song that's really a form of cultural expression for them that might bring them some comfort. Show a photo to you of their loved ones and tell a story. Could be lots of different things you offer, and then understanding if they say, nope, I gotta go. I gotta go check on my loved ones. I gotta go do some advocacy relief work. Expect that people will cancel too. That's not necessarily resistance to the mental health process and to healing and growth. That's crisis mode. They may not be actively in war, but they are feeling it inside and around them. And again, accepting maladaptive coping. I am very aware that substance use, especially alcohol, is very prevalent in this culture. I experienced it and continue to this day. There's a lot of ways that we connect through food and drink and celebration. I've also seen it really serve as a way of coping for people during times of suffering. And so I'm expecting that to really kick up, as it often does in oppressed groups. And so we might be expecting, even some prejudice coming from folks of saying, like, I don't want to talk to my Russian neighbors, right? So irrational, maybe thoughts or beliefs, and some acting out behaviors from children and adolescents. I'm already seeing that. And then the extremes of dissociation and shutdown, especially if that's a natural way that people cope. That's a strategy for survival they've already developed. And you may think, oh, that's something that they don't experience as much. They've become much more present and grounded in our work together. One, dissociation is not an evil thing. It's a way of coping. And two, screw their progress. They're at a place right now where they may need to disconnect. If it becomes harmful for them, if it becomes, what we consider like maladaptive, that's where maybe we gently point that out and just invite them to do something that's more present focused. But consider that the present is really terrifying. It makes sense that people would be dissociating and shutting down left and right now, to me at least. I already mentioned symptoms of grief and loss, even right now, as this is actively happening. Please avoid pathologizing just like you would any trauma survivor. And if you don't understand that concept, please go to that trauma-informed care considerations document. It's a manual from SAMHSA, because we really don't want to be slapping borderline diagnoses and bipolar diagnoses on folks right now, or like conduct disorder diagnoses on children. Please, 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 please wait to see if a lot of these symptoms end up being more pervasive so that they actually meet that diagnostic criteria. And when we diagnose, we want to consider cultural considerations anyway, not just what's in the DSM manual. What are the unique impacts of a crisis? You probably will see your clients showing up not their best presentational self. First of all, who cares? Second of all, that's to be expected right now. And not to be judged, right? So coming late to session, coming to session more disheveled, saying that they're not going to prioritize self-care, literally saying to you, I'm probably not going to eat very much today. My response to that would be, I get it. Also, think about what's going to happen when you completely burn out. Are you going to be able to support your friends and family and community? And that kind of empathetic challenge to them may be enough of what they need to say, okay, I will prioritize one meal while I drive, I had someone, the person that I've cited here that I interviewed, Anna, she was talking about, when someone gives me a meal, I'm more likely to eat half of it. But if I'm having to feed myself and my family right now, it's not on the priority list. She's feeding her family, but like feeding herself, right? Not going to be a high priority. I'm noticing that personally. I haven't eaten a balanced full meal in 2 weeks. It's been a lot of reverting to, for me, what was grad school type behavior, because it's high stress, high action mode. So lack of sleep impacts our cognitive functioning, impacts our emotional functioning. There's much more we can consider here. And then if you are able to do what we would consider a more traditional therapy setting, either individual or group, try to create a space where they have the invitation to do storytelling about their families when they're ready to, about their culture. Let them teach you things. Maybe provide a wooden egg so that they could create like a Pasanki egg that they could share with you. Ask them about cultural things that you see them wearing. Ask them about cultural things you've become educated in. Expect that they may not want to talk about that, but they may want to. They may want you to understand their culture much more. And do create an environment for emotional expression, but understand they may not be ready to share that wide range of emotions that we talked about. For me, doing play therapy and expressive arts therapy, I always make it an invitation. People get to decide if they accept the invitation to express themselves in a more play-based or creativity-based modality. And I also understand if they're not feeling that right now. And I think it's important that we share the personal impact of this war on us as their support system without it being too much about us. They need to know that you're watching enough of the news to understand that something devastating is happening to them. And the rest of the world is impacted by this indirectly. So you can just share, I would keep what you share focused on them. But obviously, as things develop, you can share, like, I'm scared too. I understand why you're in so much fear right now. I can't relate to it on a personal level, but I see it, I understand, and I accept it. Just starting off every session with "How are you?" is probably going to sound pretty cold and out of touch to them. So maybe reconsider how you start sessions by acknowledging the awareness you have of the pain and the turmoil that they're in. Psychoeducation when appropriate. I think it's helpful that if you're hearing your client could benefit from some resources right now, mention it to them and then offer to send it to them. Don't get into that like, "Oh, are you open to that? Will you do that for homework?" Send it to them. They'll get to it when they're ready, if they're ever ready. That's where I'm kind of trying right now in my local community. I'm going to be offering some pro bono services to people impacted, but I'm fully aware those slots may stay relatively empty because people may not be ready yet. But I have heard already there's kids in our community that are impacted. There's adolescents that are, in crisis as well. The adults may be the ones who are like, "I don't have time for therapy right now," but you never know. So offer that psychoeducation, offer the resources, but understand they may not be ready for them. And then these are two quotes from Anna that I really appreciated. And she is also a counselor, she's EMDR trained. And she commented that we need to understand what we need in order to refocus on what we can control in our world so we can help in their world. And she's referring to her experience as a Ukrainian-American immigrant and former refugee. She needs to know what she can control in her world in the US so that she can understand, okay, what do I have the capacity to help with in their world? And by the way, she's also juggling a full caseload in her own family and relationships. And then she had another statement that I was just really impacted by. She said, "It's like I took a big breath when Russia attacked, and I still can't exhale." And I found even in my interview with her and people I've been connecting with that are so directly impacted right now, I find that my nervous system shoots up into hypervigilance, into hyperarousal, and I have a hard time maintaining my breathing and my groundedness. Imagine what they're going through in their bodies. And then I do have ways people can help. I'm going to go through that and then maybe we can come back because I'm sure, Dr. Marich, you had things you might have wanted to elaborate on. So I just covered like clinical implications, and you might be sitting there thinking, "Ooh, there's other ones that are coming to mind." But what other ways can you help? As helpers and healers, we really are tasked to also do advocacy work. So I understand everyone can't give monetarily. I understand everyone is very burnout and is experiencing so much hardship right now across the board around the world. So these are just ways that I hope that people will consider that they can help over the next, 2 weeks, over the next 6 months. I don't know how long this is going to go on and how much there'll be a need. One thing you can do is offer those reduced cost or pro bono services, or just, offer some to hold some slots in your caseload. Donate to relief efforts in Ukraine. There's so many places now that, places like Washington Post, BBC, NPR, New York Times, they're all talking about these credible organizations that you can donate to. Also, consider asking someone in your local Ukrainian-American or Ukrainian-European, wherever, in their community, do they have ties to someone in Ukraine who actively needs donation money right now? Because there's lots of smaller organizations that are going relatively unfunded. And personally, I can't tell if they are reputable or if they're a Russian bot on Facebook. But when I hear someone say this is a credible place you can donate to, now I'm more likely to do that. Support your local Ukrainian businesses, schools, and places of worship. Also, Russian places of business and worship are being targeted right now, so consider them as well. They're not funded by Putin. challenge that propaganda disinformation in your community, especially in your families and friend groups that are not connected with Ukraine and Eastern Europe. When you hear them citing nonsense, call them out on it, just like you would call out misogyny, just like you would call out our political disinformation. Call it out. You never know who they're going to come in contact with that they might then have a kinder attitude towards if they understand that their information that they've absorbed is not accurate. And then there are community gatherings happening. And I keep hearing from people, I don't want to go to a protest or a vigil because I'm not part of that community. And I do understand that that community should be the ones to invite people in. And if they say, we're not accepting people outside our community right now, this is a shared, like, safe, closed space, that should be honored. But right now, they are looking overwhelmingly for support. They are looking for someone to just honk your horn if you go by a protest. These protests that I've been at, somebody honks their horn, it's a little bit of solidarity. We also hope they are donating, but honk that horn. Smile at someone that you know is part of this community that's suffering. Tell them you understand. Buy a shirt that says I stand with Ukraine, and wear it to a place where you know that visibility is going to be important. And then this is something that's been echoed from so many people that I've heard. Please check on your friends and neighbors longer than the time of active war. Please continue to remember they are going to be grieving. They are going to be unpacking the trauma from this, possibly for future generations. So check on them. Keep in mind that whole crazy history that they have is also playing out through generational trauma to them, and now they have this active trauma. And understand that they may not be energetically ready for or out loud asking right now for your support and for your compassion, and that is just where they're at right now. So I'll hop over to, for people watching this, if you want to jot down my email before Dr. Marich and I transition to discussion, please do, and then it's on the PowerPoint as well. I am happy to field questions from folks, but I do want to acknowledge that I'm not an expert in a lot of this. And so if I hear your question, I may refer you to someone else or put you in contact with them, because I don't want to speak for folks outside of this, presentation. So I will take down this slide.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nikki. Wow. I guess, an immediate question I had based on your last content slide, we've been seeing this phrase Slava Ukraini. Am I saying that correctly? Um, is that something appropriate for non-Ukrainians to say in solidarity?
I'm going to answer that
Okay,
from
but others,
my
go
perspective
ahead.
and what I've heard. Yes, super appropriate. If you're not
Mhm.
comfortable with the pronunciation, then saying glory to Ukraine. And then the echo to that is the Hoyam Slava, glory to our heroes.
Mhm.
So if you're not comfortable and want to use the English or the translation in your native tongue, go for it. But that I didn't touch on that in the presentation because there's so much discussion of it in the news right
Mhm.
now. But it is a phrase that came about, as far as I can tell, from the original independence
Mhm.
declaration, and then was really amplified with the 1991 Declaration
Mhm.
of Independence, that glory to Ukraine and glory to our heroes
Yeah.
has become a rallying cry,
Mhm.
a statement of pride. And
Mhm.
so in sharing that with someone, you are sharing solidarity or sharing support. Now, if someone from the Ukrainian community is like, wish you wouldn't, then please honor that.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you and I, like, allyship and social justice just runs through our veins anyway. We're talking about Ukraine today, but I think one of the trauma-informed ethics is that language matters and what we say matters. And so I've been seeing that phrase around, and I wanted to ask, but I think it, like you said, just good discretion if somebody says, yeah, not so much. But I know there's been a lot of press going around about the importance of saying Kyiv and using the Ukrainian spelling instead of the Russian spelling as an act of solidarity. And I just remember something I learned years ago. So my brother is also Croatian. His best friend's Ukrainian-American. And I remember he would go on his well-justified soapbox about hating when people called Ukraine the Ukraine, because that's how even a lot of other Eastern Europeans who are English speakers are raised, like, oh, the Ukraine, the Ukraine. And I really understand his point that would be more like a Russian reference, that it's like a region of Russia, or the larger, like literally the hinterland or the outlands or something like that. And so, I mean, articles aren't a thing in the Croatian language or in a lot of Slavic languages. But I think as English speakers, just recognizing that Ukraine is its own country, let's keep it
Mhm.
that way. And by calling it Ukraine and not, using that article. So, yeah, I think it's a little thing, but those little things can matter.
I did grow up hearing that frustration in my family.
Hmm.
Didn't fully understand it, kind of thought the elders were annoying when they would correct folks.
Hmm.
It was those, when your elders jump in to a
Hmm.
conversation with strangers and correct them, and you're like, stop, just
Hmm.
let us be,
Hmm.
be calm. And now I really understand it a lot better. It
Hmm.
is about identity. And I
Hmm.
think one of the closest examples or analogies I have is thinking about what the United States government and people have done to try to erase the identity of indigenous communities.
Hmm.
We not only exterminated them in different ways or attempted to, but we then forced them into uh, reservations that are really
Hmm.
another way to strip them of identity, of
Hmm.
property, right? And a lot of that goes into the language,
Hmm.
calling a reservation instead of calling it what a group of people want to call their home, whether it's the name of their tribe or whatever other language they want to use. Not only did they not choose that home, but now we're stripping them of the language around it. So that's one of the closer analogies that I have. I guess any colonized people can identify with that the language around your identity and the language you speak in general
Hmm.
um, plays a big role. I did recently see a debate from scholars, even today, about the different spellings of President Zelensky's name.
Hmm.
And they're being critical to say, yes, the more Ukrainian spelling is with two Y's at the end, but because he was a native Russian speaker in his early life, he actually didn't spell it that way. He spelled it with the Russian spelling,
Hmm.
which is in Cyrillic anyway. But um,
Hmm.
personally, I'm like, is this really the time for the debate? If it helps him express his national pride and it rallies his people who are being actively oppressed, why can't we add another Y to the name?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it's so fascinating that as you were talking, a lot was pinging for me as a fellow Slav. I'm of mixed Slavic heritage, although primarily Croatian. And a lot of the unpacking I've had to do in my own trauma work is around how that's carried down in our family and in my bloodline. And I think, and maybe I do want to go here a little bit, although, as I said, this could be an issue for another training or another debate, that I really applaud your emphasis on what we know about trauma-informed care, because this is clearly traumatic. What people both in Ukraine are going through, what people trying to flee Ukraine are going through, and what people of second and third generations here can be going through, especially if they fled persecution after the Second World War or were raised by parents who fled that persecution. We know epigenetics is real, and we know that impact in families is real when trauma is there. Um, but I think we also have to be careful. And I really think you did this in the presentation, maybe without realizing you did this, maybe you did, about not getting on our trauma-informed high horses about, psychoeducation and this is how the brain works. Because yeah, certain clients may benefit from that. And yes, I would love everyone in the world to have trauma care. But I also have to realize that culturally, the majority of my people who are still coming up, especially in Croatia, but even a lot of second and third generation people here, are part of the culture that they're getting is that these services are weakness, or these services are only for people who are like truly what they see as insane. And um, so, I don't know, because is part of cultural embracing and accepting, really recognizing that we have to be mindful about pushing our gospel of Vessel van der Kolk on people too, and realizing that we can have Bessel van der Kolk, realizing that we can have this trauma knowledge that might, help to liberate and free people and help them live a better life without pushing it on them. Because I've shared, even as an EMDR trainer, I know there's times I've gotten overzealous with all the techniques that I can offer people. So I'm so glad to hear you say, guided imagery might not be the best place to go right now. And probably the strongest lesson I got working as an educator in post-war Bosnia with Croatian children is that singing and dancing and art was a much better way to teach children English, especially traumatized children who were in both a post-war and a post-communism fallout. And that's really what started my passion for the field and healing and got me into expressive arts. And so while I think we have to be careful not to force that on people too, I know, like from the Slavic cultures I have been steeped in, uh, music and dance are our thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's our way of telling stories. It's our way of expressing. I mean, I've seen the most stereotypically hardened men get weepy singing certain folk songs.
Oh yeah.
And, is that an indoor? Is it an outlet? So I'm just really happy that you went there.
And I hope that there's opportunities maybe for clinicians to consult about this too.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it's going to be a constant decision-making process for us of what
Mm-hmm.
opportunities and what interventions to offer. I completely agree with you that pulling out charts about the nervous system and charts about the brain is probably not going to help folks right now unless they are explicitly saying, and I've had clients that when they're in crisis, they'll say, remember that stuff that we reviewed like
Mm-hmm.
a year ago? Can you pull that out again? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm usually the one who's like, are you sure that's going to serve you right now? What if we just,
Mm-hmm.
work with what's coming up? But to them, that education and knowledge is
Mm-hmm.
helpful. But I think that for the most part, from that cultural lens that you're speaking to me, it's more about offering things like opportunities to story tell, to journal, to move the body. They may
Mm-hmm.
not be up for doing folk dance, but like,
Mm-hmm.
to share what movement means to them, or to listen to cultural music or music that brings them comfort,
Right.
and then being trauma informed in our lens.
Mm-hmm.
Much less about the psychoeducation of like, here's why you're acting this way. I don't think that's super appropriate in most crisis intervention work, personally, unless
Right.
it's literally what someone's needing from you and,
Right.
and saying it.
Right. So, Nikki, just again, a beautiful presentation that I think it helped give me a frame for so much, as a clinician and really as a global citizen right now, because I think both are important. And my feeling that clinicians need to be engaged global citizens and aware of oppression and suffering and violence when it's happening. And um, I just thank you for offering this lens for us. So as a reminder, if you found the content of today's workshop useful, and we'll make this available indefinitely. And as a reminder, this is content as of March 7th, 2022. That's what we're listing here as the recording date. So this might be outdated with some of the information by the time you get it. So just a reminder to stay current with credible news outlets. Always beware the disinformation that is abounding. So yes, we encourage you to make a donation on your own to this beautiful organization that Nikki is recommending for us, Save the Children, specifically their Ukraine crisis fund. And yeah, whatever you felt this webinar was worth today, what you might have paid for it, please pay it forward by making a donation or possibly making a donation to some other organization that is speaking to you.
Can I say on the topic of
Yeah.
that organization, they have a very visible presence on social media right now, particularly Instagram is where I'm following them, but I'm sure Facebook too. Um, so for anyone who is looking for how their donations are specifically being used, you can see they'll post like statistics of where the money is going and images of the donation goods. And I think right now we have to balance our intake of traumatic images because it's also not always respectful to victims. But I've noticed their platform right now is showing a lot of the impact on victims, but also a lot of here's where your money's going.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Well, again, Nikki, thank you very much for being with us today and on this recording that we're making available to clinicians who want to take it in. And thank you for your willingness, because I know this has been hard on you on a variety of levels. And I know you're somebody who believes in advocacy and justice and paying it forward. And thank you so much for taking the time to put this together.
Thank you for the platform, the megaphone, if you will, to be able to share this. And I really invite further dialogue with folks and continued amplification of these people's suffering and their stories. So thank you.
Slava Ukraini. And
Героям
once
слава.
and once more, if you want to get the hard copy of the PowerPoint Nikki shared from, you can go to traumamadesimple.com/Ukraine. We have the PowerPoint there that you can do a direct download on that Nikki's generously offered to share with us.